Welcome my servants, my slaves.
What is your bidding, master?
You have failed me. I disavow you all.
What?
I've taken your love. Now I will take your life. Consider my power in a hollow grave.
I live again.
What is a perfect game? What is something that makes you come back for the insatiable experience that just does it when so many others couldn't? There are many reasons for a result of one's experience in any form of media. Gaming offers the most advanced form of art due to it encompassing all of the pre-existing mediums but in an interactive product. For me, gaming is that preferred medium due to its limitless exploration of pre-existing concepts and thought bubbles, ranging from abstract to concrete ideas. We can bounce from an abstract game like, say, Helix or Cruelty Squad, lucid depictions of unique ideas swimming in the heads of the developers without the worry of mass appeal. Or games that we see in the AAA department where something is made for everybody. At least that's the goal anyway. For me, a perfect game is something that ignores my mood and gives me a good time regardless. I get this in a number of games based on my personal preferences. Anything from the Doom franchise, the Soulsborne games, Sekiro, Elden Ring, any of the Source Engine games, Quake, Mount and Blade, the list goes on for me. The point is that in my perspective of a perfect game, all it needs to do is provide an enjoyable experience upon a first time visit or even a revisit, no matter my mood. In terms of shooters, the classic Doom games is one such game for me. It's old and dated, but its gameplay loop is still fun, with a dynamic range of monsters and an inexhaustible source of creativity from the modding community, which is why I've played it more than any of the other later Doom titles. In terms of the sprite-based shooters that I've enjoyed immensely, there's only been a select few that have blown me away, such as Slayers X and Cultic, two fantastic shooters that harken back to the sprite-based era of the shooter genre. But there's another one. Another game that I initially had a rocky start with, but ended up loving immensely in the same way I do with the classic Doom games. Blood. The best build engine game ever made. One of the coolest and most unique protagonists in the shooter franchise, and some of the best gameplay loops I've seen in a sprite-based shooter today. Blood is a build engine FPS developed by Monolith Productions and published by GT Interactive. Set in the earlier period of the 20th century, playing as Caleb, an elite member of a dark cult that worships the god Chernobog, that casts them down for their failure, only for Caleb to wake up again and take vengeance against the god that cast him down, and kill the zombies, cultists, ghosts, and gargoyles that get in his way, as well as those dogs that breathe fire at you. Like its predecessors that also used the build engine, it would encompass all of the benefits that the build engine could provide, on top of adding some new improvements over it, like the inclusion of volumetric pixels, also known as voxels, new lighting effects, real-time shadows, simulated rooms above rooms, as well as improved physics across the board. At the time of this game's release, we were already seeing 3D applications of polygonal-based shooters utilizing full 3D models like in the first Quake, with Quake 2 coming out the same year as Blood and making further improvements. But sprite-based shooters like Blood had more flexibility at the time in displaying a variety of objects, decorations, and enemy counts, as well as color variety that would take a bit more time for fully 3D games to implement. Its origins stem from the brains behind the project, Nick Newhard, bouncing ideas with another person, Jason Hall, about a fantasy game idea known as Gauntlet, which could be seen as a source of inspiration for Monolith's later project, Get Medieval. But due to technical complications, as well as the continued development of the build engine, as well as further work done by Nick Newhard, the idea would eventually transform into something else entirely, in the form of horror 3D, released as shareware in '94, and once again later on as Blood. Through the evolution of the companies as well as the people behind the project, Blood would end up being the game we know it today. But there is actually an alpha build of the game due to the source code at one point being leaked in '96. Blood is a game with its own mask, one that hasn't been exceeded by many other shooters even during its years. It was a game dearly loved by a number of fans, and those even in the Doom community even considered Blood to be the best build engine game ever made, and I agree wholeheartedly. And there are many reasons as for why, which I'll get into later on. Blood, like Duke Nukem 3D, has you going through place to place, finding keys and secrets, and eventually the exit door. And you do it with dynamite and a great and unique arsenal of weapons to choose from. Part of this game's magic is how comfortable it is with its gameplay. It prides itself on allowing the player to create as much chaos as possible, from the infighting of enemies to the placement of dynamite and well-timed barrel explosions, civilians made for sacrifice that run rampant as the fighting starts, and how much your character relishes in the carnage. Lots of shooters have made this lack of a personality when it comes to the fighting side of it. You just kind of go along with it naturally because those are the rules of the game. In Doom, killing demons is fun, but it's mindless because of your perception of the situation stating that these demons are evil and you're doing the right thing by slaughtering them. But in Blood, there's only evil against evil. The game is a dark and unforgiving world with little to no good in it, and the reality is you and the character that you're playing as is just as bad as the dark god that you're fighting against. And yet, the game is insanely fun in a number of ways that sets it apart from a large number of other shooters that I've also enjoyed. If you've come from other build engine games, then objectively speaking, Blood is like Duke Nukem 3D, as in how you approach everything. The vulnerability of your character facing the hit scan enemies, as well as how difficult the game is in general. It's a game that was known to be very hard during its time, and was partly why I didn't like it initially when I first tried it. There was also a weird feeling the game had with its vertical way of viewing the camera. The objects around you closely following you as you looked up and down. It's a weird effect that even Duke Nukem 3D had, and would put my aim off at times, especially when you're going through sloped surfaces. But that's just a symptom of the build engine and how the 3D effect was generated within its code. And with the combination of the game's difficulty, it was a barrier that I had to get over to truly appreciate what the game had accomplished. Its gameplay loop is one that has an ebb and flow of running wild or taking your time around each corner. It punishes you very quickly for being too careless as you approach each area. It was a mistake I often made even when I knew what was ahead of me. Blood is a game that forces you to play smarter with your approach rather than just being a raging lunatic like you can be in Doom. In that game, enemies would often have a delay before attacking, giving you a chance to get out of the way before you take damage. In Blood, you don't have that opportunity at all, and it's a thing that's not exclusive to the game either. Most, if not all of the build engine games have the enemies attack you almost instantly, making Blood in particular very unforgiving, especially if you're playing on the well done or extra crispy difficulty. I can definitely say that Blood is one of the hardest shooters made in the 90s due to the punishing cultist enemies, dogs that breathe fire and drain your health quickly, and these assholes. Even on Ultra Violence or a Nightmare, I didn't have this much trouble dealing with an enemy roster like the one you have in Blood. At times, it can even feel unfair. But that also means that it's easy to underestimate how hard this game was. In fact, it was known at the time that people complained about the difficulty of the game itself. And of course, the developers of the Postmortem episode and the two expansions made, Plasmatech and Cryptic Passage, said, hey, let's make the game even harder. Difficulty is something that needs to be balanced out to the point where it is challenging but fair. Some games I've played struggled with this idea and end up making it unfair and ultimately not fun at all. But Blood doesn't have that issue because it gives you a well thought out arsenal with plenty of utility behind it to deal with each combat scenario efficiently. There are many things that this game does right, like with its unique and amazing setting that oozes with atmosphere, the memorable enemies with lines that you can repeat in your head, a protagonist that is unique and memorable for a number of reasons, and much more. Its music is another thing too that works within the confines of the game. It's not necessarily something I would listen to on its own, but I wouldn't replace it either. Because of its horror-themed setting, something that is almost akin to the Universal classic monster films, the music is often foreboding and ambient, not loud and bombastic like Duke Nukem 3D or Doom. its attention to sound and graphics is also a huge highlight. All the weapons used in this game have some incredible sprite work, probably some of the best I've seen coming from a 90s shooter. They all feel unique and stand out with their presentation, and it doesn't go for a standard loadout either, but something reflective of the game's setting too, which I'll get into later on. The game has you going through different places, ranging from cemeteries to towns, industrial factories, dark realms, and ritualistic places in honor of the dark god Chernobog, all with the same consistent color palette, where there is nothing bright and lifelike whatsoever. Everything in this game from a graphical standpoint derives from a lifeless, industrial-filled and deathly color palette that gives Blood an identity of its own because of the circumstance of the forces at hand, the lack of anything good from both sides, as well as the choice of colors to display a cruel and unforgiving world. Each episode has its own set of levels and secret levels, keys and secret rooms, enemies to find and kill, and its own themes to appreciate. You have the Way of All Flesh, Even Death May Die, Farewell to Arms, and Dead Reckoning. These episodes conclude the story of the game, whereas other expansions like Plasmatech and Cryptic Passage add more to the platter, with one adding more single-player content and multiplayer stuff for Bloodbath, which is the game's multiplayer mode, and then there's Cryptic Passage, which follows after the events of the game's story. Speaking of the story, Blood's story is more interesting in the sense of its main character and the setting itself, but it's not going to be something that you'd see in Half-Life or Deus Ex, where it's more fleshed out and narrative-driven. You wake up from your grave and fuck everyone else. That is Blood when you boil down to it. An unapologetic game where you forget the fact that you're playing as an evil protagonist that's really no better than the dark god that he's fighting against. Speaking of which...
Time for a barbecue. I'm gonna paint the town red. No one wants to play with me. Forgive me, old friend. Truly, truly, I say unto you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you.
Delivered us from evil, for thine is the kingdom.
Most of the protagonists that we play as in shooters are often champions of the planet fighting against evil, or someone with a good heart with a personal goal that involves death and destruction. Caleb as a character is a character that has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. He is sadistic in his display of violence and makes no distinctions between those he kills. The only times where he does show some vulnerability, however, is when he finds Ophelia, his girlfriend, killed by the boss of the first episode, or when he finally confronts the Dark God about why he was casted down in the first place. From beginning to end though, he is pretty much the same person he was before, and honestly, it's incredibly refreshing. Frankly, not enough games, especially shooters, let you explore the idea of playing an inherently evil character like Caleb, and no, games with multiple choices like, say, Fallout or Elder Scrolls or most CRPG games don't count because there are other options. I am talking about a character already rooted to one path or the other, which is evil, which is what Caleb is at the end of the day. There are bad people everywhere in this game, and the innocent civilians don't stand a chance due to your indifference towards them. And also the presence of the cultists, the zombies, and the demonic creatures make it a hellish playground that is destroying itself. In games like Doom and Quake, there are opposites between you and the enemy. In Blood, you're essentially fighting your own, part of the same dark cult that you were once a part of, that you killed and slaughtered for, rising to the ranks of Chernobog's order. This makes the game and its character unique, because it makes Blood both a horror and a reverse horror game at the same time. In reverse horror, you generally play as the horror itself, and what you go up against are your victims basically. Caleb is also part of the problem here, part of the horror, and his crusade is just as bad as what's already being done to the world in Blood. Part of what makes him a great character too, though, is the work of the voice actor behind him, Stephen Waite, the heart and soul of the character that we play as, who gives Caleb a sense of personality and humanity behind the crimson red eyes. The many quotes that you can find throughout this game give further insight into his character, showing that he too has likes and dislikes, just like any other person, and the actor further hams into the evilness of Caleb, and from the voice alone you can tell that he relished at the opportunity to play as a character that is both a gunslinger and a dark cultist at the same time. Caleb stands out among many other characters due to the virtue of his chaotic but fun demeanor, who has no shred of good in him, placed in a game that is so fun to play that you ignore this fact, even though it's abundantly clear that you're a villain as well. There are also other pokes at other characters like a hanging Duke Nukem that he makes fun of, as well as references to other horror films such as The Shining and Friday the 13th.
Here's Johnny.
The weapons that he uses are also reflective of the time period he finds himself in. Since he was born in the 19th century, it would make sense for him to make use of older weapons, including the dynamite itself, which is the most skill-based weapon to use in this game. And it's not just the dynamite, there is also the pitchfork, your standard melee weapon useful for zombies while you save dynamite and ammo. The flare gun that can set enemies ablaze or create a fiery ball with the secondary firing mode. The shotgun that can be fired once or with both shells. The Tommy gun for killing rats or groups of enemies like a madman. The napalm launcher that blows up enemies and sets them on fire, and the secondary mode creating a destructive cluster. The lighter that gives way for the aerosol can that functions like a flamethrower. Like I said, the dynamite that can also be used immediately upon impact or with a timer, or the proximity attachment, or one that you can use with the remote button, making it in a way the most effective weapon in the game arguably. Then there's the Tesla gun, which is sort of like the game's BFG due to its secondary ability to just annihilate everything within range. It hits like a truck and can make quick work of some of the more powerful enemies in the game. Then finally there's the voodoo doll and the life leech weapon. One lets you damage enemies by stabbing the doll or sacrificing it for an even bigger effect. But if there's no enemies around and you use it, it does take your health away, so be careful. The life leech, another magical based weapon, is also a double-edged weapon that is used to drain the life of the enemies, and can even be used as a sentry weapon that can be picked up after using it. However, if there's no ammo for the weapon, it drains your health as well, so use it wisely. These weapons also tell you that Caleb has no qualms about the nature of the weapon, only that it can be used, even to the point of using voodoo magic or the darkest artifacts available to get the job done. He is a character with no limits at all, and this is what makes his character refreshing. As for my favourite weapons, the dynamite is a no-brainer here. Not once does it lose its usefulness, and more often than not it's a lifesaver against the cultists and the swarms of zombies in tight corridors and rooms. And that's the thing with the game's design. A lot of the rooms are dense by nature in the effort to make the dynamite effective in any situation. The flare gun is also more useful than you think. The large dudes that vomit can be killed with only 2 shots of the flare gun, and it's only just a matter of time before they set fire anyway. The napalm launcher is effective only in open areas though, because most enemies will close the distance, making it more likely for you to take damage yourself in the process. The shotgun is also really good, has a fast rate of fire and can one-shot zombies up close with 2 shells, but it's a weapon not very effective in open areas where cultists are beyond its reach, which is where the Tommy gun or even the voodoo doll or napalm launcher come in. Each enemy has a smarter way of being taken care of, and not considering which weapon is more effective will leave you dry with ammo when you really need it. Blood punishes you for being careless in both enemy awareness and use of resources. The majority of shooters, especially in the retro category, often favor a sci-fi themed setting or one with medieval aesthetics like Quake, but rarely are there any games that place you in a much older time period, like say in the early years of the 20th century or even in the Wild West. But Blood puts itself between the late 20s and even the 40s in later episodes like Farewell to Arms. The weapons you have in this game reflect that period. Caleb's familiarity with dynamite comes from his days in the Wild West, the Tommy gun being the go-to machine gun, the shotgun for something up close and personal, with everything else being a byproduct of the Dark Cult and the Dark Realm. A lot of the environments naturally blend in but still carry the same consistent tone that it excels at. While it's not as vibrant as its other build engine counterparts like, say, Duke Nukem 3D or Shadow Warrior, it's more unique with its early 20th century horror-centric setting. It's not unlike the Universal classic films that are also set in an older time period, showing a more archaic depiction of an industrial world filled with unimaginable horrors lurking about. It's a game with plenty of life beyond the gameplay as well as the character, like the cultists and their many lines of Cabal chants. The civilians that almost have no clothes and tell you to go away as you blow them up, everything else screaming and big dudes wanting you to join them as they throw up on you. The boss fights are basically bigger versions of some of the other enemies and with the right weapons can go down rather quickly, but they can do the same to you, so don't be too careless. A game's setting is just as important and can change the context of a story and its elements entirely. You're in an older time period where your weapons are older, the structures in the world too is frozen in time, with parts of it even going into the medieval realm as you traverse the sanctums and religious structures of the Cabal, places of worship for the damned. But with Caleb, he's the one with the gun. Blood doesn't tell a good and evil story, and it wouldn't work at all if it tried to do so. Its evil identity and unique setting go together like an unholy marriage, and it's partly why it's just as good as Doom. The main Doom games are a thing I can go back to no matter what. Everything about it just works for me, and after understanding Blood and ultimately falling in love with it, I have the same relationship with this game as I do with Doom, where it's pretty much replayable to an infinite degree. Its unique setting, arsenal of weapons, its character, and its evil charm make Blood one of the most enjoyable shooters I've played in a long time. And it's rare for a game to give me a lasting impression like this. Everyone has their own unique experiences. For me, Blood is now a new one to the collection of other games that have also made an impression on me, and it's a game all the way from 97, which is a testament to how well made this game truly was. For me personally, when I really think about it, what makes Blood just as good as Doom is that, like Doom, it doesn't try to be anything more. It was made to have fun with, and the themes centered around it are merely the flavor that the games provide. With more realistic experiences, I can appreciate what they try to do, but I don't find them as fun or as engaging as something with, say, an arcade nature. It lets you have fun with its own idea of physics and laws bound to the game itself. The more realistic something is, the more boring I find it personally. The icing on the top is, like I've already said, with its great setting that is unique, and I am hard-pressed to find it anywhere else. With some exceptions in the FPS genre, of course, like Blood West, Kingdom of the Dead, Gloomwood, the Bioshock games, and Cultic. Games that also harken back to an earlier 19th or 20th century setting. With Blood's setting though, it just works in combination with the addictive gunplay and the chaotic and evil character that you portray, who is given life by the fantastic work of the voice actor Stephen Way, where Caleb wouldn't be the same without his input and his unique contributions to the character. The build engine is something that marks the bridge between the sprite-based era of the Wolfenstein 3D and Doom era of shooters, and the rise of polygonal 3D-based shooters like Quake and Half-Life. The engine prospered at the wrong time, but its games stood the test of time nonetheless. The build engine and its library is one that is ultimately a mixed bag. Out of all of them, Blood is undoubtedly the best one, on the virtue of utilizing the build engine's greatest strengths, improving the use of sloped surfaces and room-over-room sectors. The addition of voxels only made it even closer to being a fully 3D experience, which could be seen in some of the game's objects as well as the weapon and item pickups. Usually in 2.5D shooters, the sprites that you see on screen follow you no matter where you go, which means you can't rotate around them. Voxels are like pixels, but with all three dimensions accounted for due to the addition of volume, and Blood makes great use of it, making a perfect blend of voxel and sprite-based graphics all together. The improved additions to the build engine's ability to display graphics was also another bonus. The sprite work on everything from the enemies to the decorations to the weapons still hold up to this day, and that's just the technical side of it, which there is a lot of, mind you. But in the side of Blood's gameplay, it's just very well thought out, and they created an arsenal of weapons that work thematically and would make sense for a character like Caleb to use. The physics and the dynamite go amazingly well here. The enemies, namely the cultists, have a memorable presence and personality, and also have a lot of meme potential in them too. Duke Nukem 3D is the shiny end of the build engine, with a great character and a fun setting and fun gameplay. but Blood is the workhorse of the build engine where you see it at its peak and what it was capable of at the time. Nowadays though, it's not as impactful as it was back then, and recent releases using the build engine have made use of the eDuke32 source port, which far exceeds the original build engine itself. Thankfully though, Blood has its own great modding scene. Modding was a godsend for 90s shooters, and just shooters in general. Classic Doom would not be as replayable if not for that. Blood was one such game that was also highly moddable, creating enhanced gameplay mods like the Extra Crispy mod, which is like the original game but on steroids, with a shit ton of new weapons, enemies, and power-ups. In fact, you can even play as iconic horror and action characters like the Terminator, Leatherface, Jason and Freddy, Candyman. A whole ton of new animations as well make it the best possible way to play Blood once you want to begin exploring the modding scene. As for map content, you have a few options, but the most notable one is Death Wish, which acts as a sequel game where you're fighting the Dark God once again, but across 30 levels, each with their own challenging arenas and features. Even though its modding community isn't as big as Doom, what's already there is fantastic, and the Death Wish and Extra Crispy mod are a must play. For the most accurate experience of the original Blood, I would recommend the Blood GDX source port, but if you have the fresh supply version, you can still add mods into it as well. The Extra Crispy mod, for instance, works with it too, as well as some of the add-on packs that you can obtain. Blood is a one-of-a-kind game, a game with so many things it does right and some things that may boil down to whether you can tolerate it or not. Enemy variety is something that's a bit dull compared to say Doom, but the cultists are fun to fight. They force you to play smarter due to how deadly they can be, as well as the cheeky rats and annoying ghosts and large gargoyles that hit like a truck. Its setting and atmosphere is amazing, and the weapon arsenal is great in its utility, not to mention some of the power-ups that really give you an edge and add even more verticality, like the jumping boots for instance. Its refreshing take on making you play as an immoral, evil character and relishing in it only enhances the enjoyment of the experience, making Blood, like I said, a horror game and a reverse horror game at the same time. The game is very hard though, even harder than Doom I'd argue. But once you get comfortable with your arsenal and learn to use them properly, it becomes more manageable over time. If you want the peak of the build engine, the best that it can offer, this is it in my opinion. The only other recent boomer shooter that comes close to the same feeling as Blood is Cultic, which is another game I look forward to talking about in the future. I also look forward to eventually getting around to the sequel of Blood, which is something that I've heard mixed things about. Blood, however, is an absolute must-play. Just don't blow yourself up with dynamite while installing it. Thank you for watching.